Hi Guy, welcome back. TV spoilers reveal that Abby didn't lose control in a single explosive moment. Her unraveling began quietly. The instant she realized Dominic was no longer within her line of sight. At first it was only a skipped heartbeat, an empty space in her chest when she turned and didn't find his familiar shape anywhere nearby. She tried to reassure herself that Dominic had simply wandered behind a corner, absorbed in some harmless game, swept up in the kind of childlike curiosity that had startled her 100 times before. But minutes passed, and the reassurance began to collapse under the weight of one brutal fact: no sign, no voice, no movement. The longer Abby searched, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the world itself was resisting her breath. Sounds around her stretched into harsh echoes that made her flinch. She forced herself to think logically, to retrace small details, to stitch together a sequence of ordinary events that could prove this was nothing more than a momentary scare. Yet the harder she tried to hold on to reason, the more she felt it slipping through her fingers like sand. Abby wasn't panicking because she was weak. She was panicking because Dominic wasn't only a child who might be lost. Dominic was the point of stability she clung to when everything else in her life felt chaotic. If Dominic could vanish, then control itself could vanish too, leaving Abby with a cold, hollow fear she didn't know how to survive. Her worry didn't stay at the level of normal concern. It swelled minute by minute, like a tide rising without warning, pushing her into sharper vigilance. Abby began scanning the people around her with a new kind of suspicion, as if anyone might hold the answer to Dominic's disappearance or might be the danger. She'd been too naive to see. She made herself follow steps that felt sensible, check the places a child might wander, imagine the directions Dominic could have run on instinct. But reality betrayed her. No one had seen him. There was no trace, no distant burst of laughter to cling to. Only a silence that grew heavier until it felt like an accusation. Abby could almost feel time aligning itself with the worst possibilities. Because the longer Dominic remained unseen, the less believable it became that this was only a game. Two forces tore at her from the inside, one part desperate to believe in the harmless explanation, so she wouldn't collapse. The other part screaming at her to accept the threat so she could act fast enough to save him. That inner war exhausted her. But it also tightened her into something dangerously tense, so taut that a single new detail could snap her. As the sky darkened, Abby hated the changing light. Dusk didn't just cover the corners of the area, it poured into her thoughts, making every nightmare scenario easier to picture. The shadows seemed to multiply her fear, and she could no longer carry it alone. Reaching out to Devin wasn't simply asking for help. It was Abby admitting she needed someone beside her so the panic wouldn't swallow her whole. When she found him, she spilled everything she knew and everything she didn't, speaking too fast, as if naming the disappearance could make it concrete, something she could grab and hold. But the more she spoke, the clearer the truth became. Dominic wasn't here, and no one had seen him. Abby searched Devin's face for a steady anchor, for a calm certainty she could borrow. What she saw instead was something darker than panic. Devin's suspicion forming, sharp and immediate. Devin didn't offer empty comfort. He tried to keep his voice level, because he understood that calm was the only thing he could give Abby in that moment. He promised they would find Dominic, but even that promise carried a strain he couldn't hide. Devin was already seeing what Abby was fighting to avoid. A child doesn't vanish without a trace in a populated area unless something is wrong. Abby's emotions were pulling her in every direction, but Devin was forcing himself into focus. He registered the gaps, the lack of witnesses, the way the absence didn't behave like ordinary mischief. And when he looked at Abby, he didn't just see a terrified mother. He saw someone silently stabbing herself with blame, even before anyone could speak the words out loud. Devin knew that if he let Abby cling to the idea that Dominic was merely playing, she would shatter even harder when the truth hit. So he began to think about the one step that would change everything, step neither of them wanted: calling the police. That decision wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. Calling the police meant admitting this could be serious. It meant Abby had to face the fear she'd been trying to smother under denial. To Abby, involving the police felt like stamping the word failure onto her skin, like saying out loud that she had lost Dominic. She hesitated, her mind still trying to bargain with reality, still begging for the story to be harmless. But helplessness grew until it pushed her past pride, past shame, past the desperate need to believe she could fix it alone. Her worry had outgrown her ability to self-soothe. It had become a constant tremor in her chest, demanding action, demanding movement. demanding she tear through anything standing between her and her child. Devin understood that delay only helped whoever had Dominic. So he and Abby stepped into a colder awareness together. This didn't look like a game anymore. Night was falling, Dominic was gone, and the silence around them had become a trap closing in. While Abby and Devin were spiraling into search and suspicion, Mariah was slipping deeper into a road she could no longer reverse. For Mariah, the moment to stop had already passed. Even if part of her wanted to turn around, confess, and claw her way back to sanity, the fear of being caught and the terror of consequence tightened around her like a noose. The more she moved forward, the more she convinced herself there was no choice left. In her mind, stopping didn't mean accountability, it meant destruction. Mariah felt hunted even if she wasn't yet being chased. And that feeling didn't come only from Abby or Devin. It came from her own conscience pounding inside her, demanding she look at what she was doing. And because Mariah couldn't bear that gaze, she kept running from it. Ian Ward wasn't physically beside her, but he might as well have been. The hallucinations weren't fleeting shadows. They were whispers with claws, gripping her thoughts, steering her breathing, shaping her decisions. Mariah was unstable, and instability made her vulnerable to the one voice that pretended to offer certainty. Ian kept delivering the worst possible advice. And what made it truly terrifying was that Mariah didn't hear it as bad advice. She heard it as survival. In her distorted reality, Ian wasn't Dengar, he was a map, a doorway, the only one who understood. He urged her toward a place where she and Dominic would never be found. And Mariah clung to that idea because it promised escape from shame, from confrontation, from the unbearable sight of Abby's grief and Devin's disappointment. She wasn't moving like a triumphant villain. She was moving like a person convinced that the only way to live was to disappear. Mariah kept trying to tell herself a story she could endure. She told herself that once they reached that place, everything would quiet down, that the panic would dissolve, that the world would stop pressing in. But every step only pulled her deeper into darkness. Turning back would mean facing what she'd done, taking a child, shattering Abby, forcing Devin into desperation, turning a family's love into terror. Those truths were sharp enough to kill the part of Mariah that still wanted to be good. So she latched onto Ian like driftwood in a storm. Even though that driftwood was dragging her under, her mind blurred the line between her own thoughts and the hallucinations' commands. That confusion made her more dangerous not because she wanted to harm anyone, but because she was no longer capable of recognizing how badly she was harming them. Back with Abby, each second without Dominic felt like being torn in half. Fear twisted into anger, and the anger turned inward, burning her with an ugly, punishing self-blame. Abby wanted to believe Dominic was simply lost, but her body refused to accept that comfort. Her heart raced, her hands went cold, her thoughts spun until every breath hurt. Devin tried to be the anchor, but he was being stretched to fighting to keep Abby upright while confronting the terrifying possibility that Dominic was already far away. Devin understood that once the police were involved, everything would escalate. It might help save Dominic, but it would also unleash consequences no one was ready to face. And still, the choice had already been made by the disappearance itself. Time was moving. Darkness was growing. The longer the silence lasted, the more it felt like an enemy. The tension thickened until even small delays became unbearable. A late text, a call that didn't connect, a stranger's glance. Abby jumped at everything because everything felt like a signal. Devin forced himself to stay controlled, but his suspicion sharpened. If Dominic hadn't vanished on his own, then someone had taken him and someone had a purpose. Devin didn't let his mind sprint too far ahead because he feared speculation would crush Abby before action could save her. He held onto what he could prove: no one had seen Dominic, and the night had swallowed the last easy explanations. On Mariah's side, the darkness felt like protection. She believed that if she could reach the place Ian described, she would be safe. Dominic would be safe, at least by the warped definition she was clinging to. Ian's voice grew more forceful, as if even the hallucination understood time was running out. Mariah felt someone closing in, even if she couldn't see them. And that fear made her grip Dominic's future even tighter. Dominic was too small to resist in any way that could break the spell Mariah was under. And his smallness fed her illusion that she was still in control. But then, far ahead, a thin slash of light cut through the darkness, something sudden and unnatural. Like a search beam, like a tension sweeping the night. Mariah froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. And in her head, Ian didn't soothe her. He pushed her harder. Go faster. Go deeper. Disappear. Night fell fully, like a door slamming shut. Abby felt the world tip into a harsher reality where Dominic could be anywhere beyond her reach. Devin still promised they would find him, but the promise sounded heavier now. Because both of them had accepted what Abby had been trying to deny. This wasn't behaving like a child's game. Their fear had matured into certainty that something was wrong. Abby's panic sharpened into a desperate readiness to fight. Because the alternative waiting like surrender. Devin watched Abby and saw she was nearing a breaking point, and if Dominic didn't come back soon, Abby wouldn't just lose her composure. She might lose the last piece of herself that still believed the world could be trusted. And just when Abby forced herself to inhale slowly, trying to keep her knees from collapsing under the weight of dread, a small detail surfaced like a cruel signal. Something faint, something too late. The suggestion of a trace, a hint that Dominic had been close so closely moments ago. Abby's blood turned cold because that didn't feel like comfort. It felt like proof that Dominic had been shifted out of reach at the exact moment. She wasn't looking. And in that instant, Abby understood the most terrifying possibility of all. They weren't just searching the night. The night was being used against them, and whoever had Dominic might be listening, watching, and staying one step ahead. Victoria wasn't used to feeling cornered to the point where she had to breathe on sheer willpower. To her, Newman Enterprises wasn't just a corporation, it was the spine of the family. The symbol of power and order the Newmans had built through years of fighting and sacrifice. But this attack didn't resemble any blow she'd faced before. It wasn't loud, physical, or direct. It was cold, methodical, and relentless, spreading like a toxic fog that made even the strongest systems begin to tremble. Victoria could feel it everywhere, confidence eroding, staff growing anxious, partners hesitating, shareholders demanding answers. And she'd the center of it all, forced to confront the fear of losing the very thing she was responsible for protecting. Her confusion wasn't a lack of competence. It was the reality of a war being fought under a harsher set of rules, where an enemy didn't need to show their face to cause damage. They only had to inject chaos into the system and wait for the Newman family to grind itself down under the pressure. In that suffocating storm, Nate became an unexpected source of stability. He didn't arrive with empty promises that everything would be fine. And he didn't try to play hero for attention. What he brought was quieter and more valuable, a patience that didn't crack when the crisis refused to ease, a steadiness that stayed upright even when the ground felt unstable. Nate found Victoria at the moments she was most drained, when exhaustion wasn't merely visible on her face but lodged deep in her eyes, when every decision felt like dragging a boulder uphill. He comforted her through presence, through the simple refusal to treat her desperation as something to judge or dismiss. Victoria rarely allowed anyone to witness her weakness, but with Nate, she no longer had the strength to pretend she wasn't affected. Her gratitude toward him wasn't sentimental. It was grounded in a brutal truth. He stayed, even when the situation grew too heavy. When Victoria spoke to Nate, she didn't soften the language to make it bearable. She called it exactly what it felt like: a digital nuclear winter Kane had unleashed on her family. It wasn't a disaster of flames and smoke, it was a catastrophe of freezing systems, paralyzed trust, and relentless doubt. In Victoria's mind, Kane wasn't simply attacking a company. He was attacking legacy, reputation, and the stability the Newmans had paid too high a price to maintain. And what stung most was that the threat didn't stand alone. Phyllis's presence hovered over it, all sharp, calculating, survival-driven, like a second blade working in tandem with Kane's. Together, they weren't just trying to shake Newman Enterprises. They were trying to seize it, using a pathway designed to look legitimate while stripping Victoria of the time and space to stop it. Nate listened, and he understood something essential. Beneath Victoria's anger was the exhaustion of someone who had fought too many battles and was still being forced to fight another. He couldn't claim he could solve everything, he knew how complicated the attack truly was. But he still moved like a knight in shining armor in the most practical way possible. He searched for any advantage, no matter how small, that could return control to Victoria. He might not be able to fix the entire war, but he could become the person who discovered a key, a flaw, a crack in the enemy's plan. Nate didn't comfort Victoria simply to calm her down. He observed. He absorbed details. He quietly collected fragments and tested how they fit together, because he believed a turning point was possible if they found the right pressure point. That turning point began with what seemed like an accidental moment, but it carried the weight of fate. Nate overheard a conversation between Audra and Bill, not out of curiosity or malice, but because circumstance placed him close enough to catch what wasn't meant to be spoken openly. The discussion had the tense, coded quality of people standing near the edge of danger. They didn't spell everything out, but every phrase hinted at a bigger scheme. Kane and Phyllis weren't merely destabilizing Newman Enterprises. They were attempting a takeover, carefully engineered, strategically timed, and wrapped in procedures meant to appear lawful. And Nate didn't need every detail to recognize the pattern. A few key implications, the way Audra framed certain points and the way Billy reacted, were enough for Nate to sense a structure if their plan depended on looking legitimate. Then it also depended on people not noticing the weakness hidden inside it. Nate's instincts locked onto that weakness. It might have been a legal technicality in how the takeover was structured, a concealed piece of evidence revealing intent, or a procedural misstep they assumed no one would catch quickly enough. He knew he was brushing against something dangerous. Information like this could save Victoria a bit if it leaked. It could also paint a target on his back. Still, the moment he pictured Victoria worn thin, standing inside that cold corporate winter, Nate refused to retreat. He didn't need praise. He needed to give her a chance to strike back. Sometimes, one small piece of trust delivered at the right moment could collapse an entire plan built on precision. The instant Nate understood the value of what he'd heard, he didn't hoard it. And he didn't turn it into leverage for himself. He went straight to Victoria, but his caution made it clear he respected the stakes. He didn't arrive triumphant. He arrived as if he were carrying a sharp blade, useful but capable of harm if handled carelessly. Nate chose his words with precision, not for drama, but to protect the integrity of the information. He told Victoria he'd heard something significant, that it involved Kane and Phyllis's takeover strategy, and that within it he had identified what looked like a legal gap or hidden evidence they were trying to bury. He didn't exaggerate. He simply placed the truth in front of her and let her see what it could become. Victoria's first reaction was stunned silence, in it because she doubted him, but because she'd been locked in defense mode for so long that any sudden spark of hope felt almost unreal. Yet within seconds, her instinct snapped back into place. She grasped the importance immediately, because she understood the kind of game Kane and Phyllis were playing. The more sophisticated the scheme, the more it relied on timing and secrecy. And if Nate had seen the crack, then the entire structure could be shaken. Her exhaustion didn't vanish, but something else replaced it: focus. The sharp, controlled intensity of a leader preparing to counterattack. She didn't waste time interrogating how Nate overheard it. She didn't get lost in the smaller details. She wanted only the essentials: where the weakness was, how the evidence could be used, and what steps needed to happen now to turn it into a weapon. In that moment, the bond between Victoria and Nate shifted. On the surface, they were still friends. Nate still acted like someone standing beside her without demanding anything in return. But intimacy doesn't always announce itself with grand declarations. Sometimes it forms in crisis, when one person sees the other breaking and chooses to stay anyway. Victoria leaned on Nate, not because she was helpless, but because she recognized the value of a loyal ally in a war built on betrayal. She genuinely appreciated the comfort he gave, not only because it eased her loneliness, but because it reminded her she wasn't completely surrounded by enemies. Nate felt the shift too. He didn't name it, but he noticed how Victoria looked at him now, not as a convenient presence, but as someone she could trust again, even though trust had been worn down by too many battles. With Nate's information in hand, Victoria moved fast, mapping out a new strategy. She didn't indulge in relief, because relief wouldn't defeat Kane and Phyllis. She needed a plan: clear, precise, and aggressive. She began to envision how to apply legal pressure. How to turn the hidden evidence or legal error into a spear aimed at the heart of the conspiracy. This counterstrike wasn't only about defending Newman Enterprises. It was about forcing Kane and Phyllis out of their comfortable positions, stripping them of momentum and making them react. Victoria knew that in a legal and corporate war, the side forced to explain itself first is often the side that has already been pulled out of safety. The change in Victoria was immediate, but it wasn't magical. It was the transformation of someone who had hit the bottom of despair and suddenly found a way to climb. She was still tired. The pressure still weighed heavily. But now she had direction, and direction gave her power. Victoria was no longer standing in the storm simply trying to survive it. She was beginning to calculate how to use the storm as cover for her own strike. She prepared to apply legal pressure, ready to flip the entire board against Kane and Phyllis. And every step she planned carried the hard, necessary coldness of someone who knew mercy had no place in this war. Kane and Phyllis had chosen battle. Victoria wasn't going to ask them to stop. She was going to make them pay. Nate watched Victoria regain her edge, and he felt both relief and a rising sense of danger. Relief because he had truly helped her. Danger because he understood what came next. Once Victoria counterattacked, the war would intensify. Kane and Phyllis wouldn't sit still. They would look for ways to retaliate, twist the narrative, bury the evidence, or drag Victoria into a new maze of legal complications to stall her. Nate didn't say it out loud, but his caution sharpened. By stepping clearly onto Victoria's side, he had potentially placed himself in the line of fire. Yet he didn't regret it. If Victoria was standing at the edge of a cliff, giving her a rope mattered more than staying safely distant. As Victoria prepared to move, she kept Nate close as a quiet source of strength. Not because she couldn't stand on her own, but because she understood the rare value of someone who could offer both comfort and solutions. Their relationship remained officially friendship. Still, the recent closeness between them created a new space where something romantic could eventually take root, even if neither of them was ready to name it. Victoria didn't let herself drift into longing because the war wasn't over. But deep beneath her controlled exterior, a small part of her recognized that Nate had stepped into the most private territory of her life, the territory of fear and vulnerability she rarely showed anyone. And Nate, without seeking it, had become the one person who could touch that softness without making Victoria feel threatened. The closer she got to acting, the sharper Victoria became. She began aligning Nate's discovery with the broader picture of the attack on Newman Enterprises. And the more she did, the more convinced she became that Kane and Phyllis had overplayed their confidence. They believed Victoria was too exhausted to strike back. They assumed she would remain trapped in damage control. They counted on the cold, paralyzing winter they had engineered. They didn't anticipate that within that winter, Victoria could still find a fire. And that fire had a name, a loophole, hidden evidence. A mistake they dismissed because they believed no one would be close enough or smart enough to see it. Nate saw it, and Victoria intended to turn that sight into a verdict. When the counterattack finally took shape, Victoria prepared to trigger the legal pressure that could send Kane and Phyllis reeling. She didn't rush, but she didn't hesitate either. She moved with the decisive focus of someone who had endured enough and now chose to end the game on her own terms. And just before she took the first step, she paused for a single beat, looking at Nate with an expression that held both gratitude and unspoken weight. If she understood that if the strike succeeded, everything would shift, but if it failed, they would enter an even more ruthless phase where mistakes would be fatal, and trust would become a luxury. Hook, Victoria tightened her grip on the documents, ready to activate the legal blow that could flip the entire war. While across the battlefield, Kane and Phyllis still believed she was only barely holding on. They had no idea a crack had been exposited the moment Victoria moved. The digital nuclear winter they unleashed would snap into reverse, transforming into a storm that would surge straight back toward them. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.